sharing a little bit about sort of my process curating this exhibition, as well as like some of the artists that are a part of the show and their intentions with some of the works. And so I thought that it would be possibly very helpful to start talking a little bit about Taller Comunidad La Goico, which is the place where this exhibition is situated, and then also to talk about, I guess, why I think it's very important that it's housed there. And so before Taller Comunidad La Goico became Taller Comunidad La Goico, or La Goico as like it's known around here, it used to be the Pedro G. Goico Public School, and it was a school that served a lot of the children around sort of the Barrio Machuchal and Calle Loíza, which is part of a bureau called Santurce within San Juan. And so in 2015, when the school or the public school was closed at the hands of our government, which is a very like a busy topic that started around 2007, when a lot of public schools started closing in Puerto Rico. Around, I think to this day, I think it's very close to 700. And this was a result of a lot of natural disasters and their aftermaths, a lot of hurricanes and earthquakes, as well as I think a bigger issue, which has created a very fragile school system in Puerto Rico that has been sort of decisions made by the Fiscal Oversight Board in Puerto Rico, and their austerity measures that are all about sort of prioritizing the payments of the Puerto Rican debt, sort of guaranteeing payments to bondholders over sort of the essential services that could be granted to Puerto Ricans. And so the school was closed in 2015, and quickly right after, a lot of community members in El Barrio Machuchal and Calle Loíza gathered together to start to rehabilitate and open up this space to other community members. And so it wasn't until 2020 that this space sort of regained a name as a cultural center for the vicinity and sort of became a pillar of the community, sort of offering a lot of support and aid in troubling times, as well as hosting sort of concerts, health fairs, environmental workshops, and things like that. And so for me, I think it was very important to have this exhibition be hosted in this place. Also in Puerto Rico, I think that like having this sort of conversation in the context where a lot of these things happen was very important to me. And then also having it be included as part of a project such as La Goico felt very, just very familiar. And I think that choosing this space sort of became a way to not only sort of honoring that rich past history of the school and the work that is being sort of presently done there, but then also kind of understanding this idea of occupation of these unused spaces as a futurist practice in Puerto Rico that ultimately is all about securing permanence and a future for Puerto Ricans. And I think that that was one of my main sort of goals in choosing this space when I had that decision. And so I think it very well goes with a lot of like what this exhibition is about, which I think that through this project, I just had the amazing opportunity to work with a lot of artists whose works sort of engage with in political imaginaries, thinking of speculative fictions, world building, Caribbean futurism, and reinterpretations of the past, present, and futures as a response to Puerto Rico's colonial realities. And so these artists are doing that in many, many different ways, but they're all thinking of this idea of the radical imaginary and the political imaginaries as these tools for self-determination, for emancipation, for visualizing themselves in the near future and the further future. And so I think a lot of these artists in this exhibition will be offering alternatives and ways to think about how to access the past, how to traverse the present, and how to produce these like future forms of knowledge that ultimately, again, are thinking about a Puerto Rico for and with Puerto Ricans. And so I think that was my main look or objective with gathering this set of artists. And I think it was very hard to narrow down and choose the group of artists that would be a part of this exhibition. I think there are so many artists in Puerto Rico right now. I think a lot of it kind of our present situation makes us think a lot about what will happen in the future. And I think that we think a lot about spaces and people in that way. I think that many of us visit the island and think about what things will no longer be there eventually, or what things will be there. And I think that there's a big sense of thinking about the past, really cherishing the present, and then also sometimes like thinking about what could possibly be. And so I think that those feelings also have been a big part of my own experience being here. And so I wanted to kind of gather a set of artists who were also thinking about that. And so I think that we can start looking at the scan first and begin with Amanda's video work, Hoy en Uno, or Hole in One. We're going to play a little bit of the video first for you guys to see, and then I'll go into and talk a little bit about it. Yeah, so there's a little bit more to this video, but Amanda and Leonel Rodriguez are working on the streets of Puerto Rico and sort of embodying the role of golf players, attempting to hit these golf balls into asphalt potholes in the streets. And so I think that for me, this work just made sense to include it, because I think that it is the type of work that in some way, not only is kind of proposing this imaginary environment where both these artists are critiquing and using this like very present day landscape to kind of think about the future of this space that is moving towards possibly more resort-like spaces that are at the exclusive service of wealthy tourists and people who visit, and so that have left a very undeniable mark in Puerto Rico. And I think that for me, I think there's a little bit of like absurdity or absurd actions that kind of come into play with this video, that it like felt like it should be a part of a lot of these conversations about creating like these sort of parallel worlds, or these like speculative actions that can ultimately critique both our present day and then also think about like the future of these landscapes, whether they are economic or related to tourism. And so for me, this like performance in a way kind of counters both the performativity of tourism too, and sort of the transformation of these landscapes and that have been mainly very much like misrepresented in the Caribbean. And when speaking to Amanda, I think that there's also a little bit of these other practices that are not necessarily related at all or thought of in the context of contemporary art. But in Puerto Rico, sometimes when people are very I guess, appalled by these holes on the street, they will plant sometimes like planting trees on the potholes, you know, as a way to kind of like bring, I guess, attention to this thing that is happening there. And so I think that there is some of that absurdity that like filters into real life, and then also kind of what we think of what is contemporary art. And so I think that this work sort of exists in that universe. And also speaking to Leonel, who is the caddy in this video, he was talking about kind of how the action of like going onto the highway and pretending to hit this golf ball and like having all this happen in a very like guerrilla style way kind of became a kind of an energy that continued to fuel the way that this video was like coming about. And so I think that there is something very particular that, you know, like these artists are using, again, kind of this like present day environment to kind of speculate and think about this other parallel world where they are these like golf players. They're not just Amanda and Leonel kind of like walking around the streets of Puerto Rico, but they've kind of embodied and speculate through that embodiment of these other characters. And so it's a video that I really like. And then I think kind of going off with that same idea of like this absurd tone and like dark humor, I think that we can move on to Jose Luis Vargas's Ya es muy tarde, or It's Already Too Late, which I think also gathers a little bit about of that dark humor or cynicalness in a way. And Jose Luis is an artist that has been working and practicing in Puerto Rico for many, many years. He's someone that I've looked up to since I was in college doing my undergrad. And so it's been a real pleasure to work with him, someone who's been not just a pillar of you know, the art, like community of artists in Puerto Rico, but someone who has had a big like pedagogical lens that definitely has always intersected with these ideas of spirituality, of fantasy, of myth, of science fiction. And so it's just been really great to work with him. And in this work specifically, he's tackling the idea of this subject called El Gara Diablo or Gara Diabolo, which is this sort of stingray fish with like these diabolical features and kind of very anthropomorphic construction that was discovered by Alfredo Garcia Garamendi in the 1970s. And this creature has a lot of history. It's quite interesting. It involves universities around Puerto Rico and a lot of like investigation. And so it's just this whole history of kind of like the 70s. And so he is thinking a little bit about this mythical creature monster. And we talked a little bit about these monsters sort of surfacing in times of crisis and how, for example, Puerto Rico is known for being the birthplace of El Chupacabra, as well as having one of the only, or probably the first, UFO airport, kind of around Lajas in the southern part of the archipelago. And so we were talking about how much the government and you know, has like invested into a lot of these stories that have ultimately kind of become distractions to, you know, moments of recession, of distress, of catastrophe, and how these sort of monsters come up whenever these things are also happening outside of your house. And so we talked a lot about those parallels, as well as his own kind of, I guess like his own connection that he makes to between El Gara Diablo and also the Puerto Rican identity, as these sort of creatures or subjects that have been distanced from their context, ultimately kind of engaging in this struggle to self-define. And so he thinks a lot about how El Gara Diablo is this like myth that not only varies depending on generations and regions, but it's this sort of subject that you can ask someone who's older than you, and they'll have a different description with similar kind of elements to it. And so it's this ever-changing, always being defined by this outside world, never being able to kind of like present itself, you know, and say what it is, you know. And so I think that there is this distance in its own perception and its own description, and it's always kind of at the mercy of always being described by others. And so he thinks a lot about that Gara Diablo and how it possibly could relate to a lot of these ideas of being distanced to be able to self-define, you know. And so I thought that was like quite interesting. And I think El Gara Diablo also is this like generational pulling, like kind of creature. And so kind of with this combination of like dark humor and sort of allusions to the supernatural, he begins to kind of both redefine these like individual and collective imaginaries of these creatures, and then also how they relate to our own perceptions of ourselves individually and collectively. And then next to that work, we have Jezabeth González's Isla Flotante, or Floating Islands, as well as Tierra Prensada, which is pressed soils, maybe if I wanted to try to translate that. And I really appreciate Jezabeth's work. I think they work at this level of intimacy and privacy, possibly like just intimacy that I really value. And so with this work specifically, Jezabeth is kind of going back to this saying that their father used to say about Puerto Rico being this floating island. And so he would say that Puerto Rico would move a few centimeters every day. And so with sort of this statement, Jezabeth embarks on this journey of beginning to ask their family what it would be like, what they would think, you know, kind of a very like narrative and speculative exercise of imagining what it would be like to live on this like island that floats, which we know that Puerto Rico doesn't necessarily, like it doesn't, you know, it does shift in the way that land shifts, but it is not a floating island. And that kind of reading also connects to kind of thinking about tectonic plates and how the archipelago is a product of lava that has erupted from like underwater volcanoes. And so that kind of connects us to think about earthquakes. And actually, let me stop talking for a little bit. Maybe we can play it for a tiny bit and I'll continue to give more info on it.
Y entonces yo pensaba que estábamos en una isla flotante. ¿Qué tú visualizas?
Pues se verían las diferentes capas de la Tierra. O sea, colores, diferentes colores. Textura, puede tener tierra, piedra. Y obviamente el agua, porque si se parte se va a ver el océano, el mar Caribe.
Basically, and Jezabeth kind of like establishes this sort of dialogue with their family where they ask them like what it would be like to kind of be on this like floating island, and you've seen there kind of a little bit of their responses. But I think that is quite interesting. It also was filmed at the time of a lot of earthquakes that were happening in the archipelago. So there's a lot of also of that context coming in, as well as conversations about that. And so I think that Jezabeth finds a way to kind of like skillfully kind of combine like these fictions and these like speculative inquiries into their family, which become very personal, but then also kind of, I think what is most valuable, at least for me, is that there is this like discussion about what it would be like to be on a floating island. And at a moment, Jezabeth's grandma says that she would like stay still and move wherever the land takes her. And I think that was very powerful. And I think it begins to kind of create these connections of not just like, let's imagine what it would be like to be on a floating island, a place where we just have to move with and adapt and change and kind of be at the mercy of, but that is literally the context in which this video is happening, of a lot of like the island's floating political, social, economic realities. And so I think that the video is very sensible in kind of creating a connection between that. And right next to, oh, and before we move, actually, I was going to say too that this work also has this kind of segment of soil, of pressed soil, or these like sort of stamps of soil, which are of this like mold that Jezabeth created of their door at their house in Añasco. And so there are these little stamps on the ground with soil that are replicating that door in their house. So I think that the level of how personal this work becomes is quite lovely. And so right next to that, there is Maria Jose's work, La Futura, which is this dress that is inside the gallery. We're going to try to find the best way to like show it to you guys, but it's this dress that is on top of, kind of on the ceiling, on this clothesline, and then it also has this audio that plays outside the gallery. So this is a kind of a piece that includes both audio and the video. We're gonna play it fully because it's quite short, and then I'll go into talking about it.
O te encierras en tu cuarto a inundarte en tu propio veneno, o te unes a nuestro movimiento de amor y justicia para todos.
Great. So this work is made by Maria Jose, who is this transdisciplinary artist, activist, musician that was present during the Riti Renuncia protests in 2019, which were these set of protests that happened in Puerto Rico and beyond, truly, to request and the resignation of our then governor, Ricardo Rosselló. And so this work, I really appreciate the title, which for those who might not know Spanish, La Futura is this sort of like play on words that is proposing the singular feminine La Futura as a challenge to the singular masculine El Futuro, which would mean the future, but in sort of a feminized form of the word. And so Maria Jose's work, both this one and the one outside, are speaking to sort of a future that completely defies these modernist and national conceptions of gender, race, class, disability, progress, among other topics. And Maria Jose is sort of focusing on a future that is able to recognize and continue to challenge the work that is presently being made on her own vision and her community's vision of what the future could be. And a future that's more than anything is already here. And so I think that that's what's very valuable about this work, that Maria Jose and a lot of the artists also in this exhibition are not thinking of necessarily the future as this far away distance temporality, but something that is currently happening in the now, and then it also ties back to the past. And so it's a sort of like circular, ever-shifting, happening at the same time set of actions. And so I think Maria Jose's work definitely is thinking about that. And we decided to kind of put the audio outside of the gallery as a way to not only kind of become this sort of inviting thing, but because a lot of it happens in the context of a protest, we just thought that having it be projected into the open space to be able to play outside of the gallery made a lot more sense. And it becomes sort of this way of like suddenly occupying. So the audio plays every around 10 minutes. So as people are kind of inside and both outside, they're greeted in some ways by Maria Jose's incredible speech. And the decision to kind of include this dress was a very last minute thing that we had been talking about, but weren't sure necessarily how it would come into play with a lot of the other works there and all that sort of stuff. But the dress that is being hung on this clothesline is Maria Jose's dress from when she kind of performed this speech at one of the rallies. And so it became, I think, more than anything, a way for Maria Jose to sort of commemorate who she was at the time, and to also kind of recognize the growth throughout those years and the years in general. And so we decided to kind of place it high up on the ceiling. As you can see, I don't know if it's very obvious when you see the video, but Maria Jose is on top of a truck, basically, talking about this speech. And so it's very high up. And so we kind of wanted to replicate that in a way and give it that sort of presence that for sure it required. And next to Maria Jose's work, we have Echoes of a Tumbling Throne, which is a piece by Sofia Cordova. The full title of it is Echoes of a Tumbling Throne, Odas al Fin de los Tiempos, Level 8, Cuerpo a Cuerpo. And so Sofia is an incredible artist who has definitely been thinking about sci-fi, futurisms, Caribbean futurisms, Afrofuturism, in general for many, many years. And so I was really excited to have her be a part of this exhibition. And this work specifically is also part of a broader series of works. But this one specifically kind of it's a very narrative exercise that goes into this character called Ray K16, which he is a wandering cyborg in the future that has been sort of constructed through video installation, music performance, and other elements. And so through this narrative exercise, Sofia is questioning the problematic nature of the concept of singularity, which has been proposed by Ray Kurzweil, and how this concept specifically intersects with ideas of gender, race, and class. And so this concept, which maybe you might not know by name, but I think is very familiar in our environment, specifically in the last couple of years, is proposing that in a very near future, following the sort of advent of artificial intelligence, man and machine will merge and will in some ways render humans immortal. And so Sofia is thinking about kind of what does this mean? How are the powers shifting with concepts like this and the future looking like this according to this one person? And so it's a very interesting long narrative exercise that kind of goes into, there are many parts to it. I guess one of the highlights are kind of how this idea or promise of immortality becomes a curse eventually for this character, Ray K16, and how, let's play a tiny bit. I get very excited talking about it and then forget that I need to show you guys the video.
I am Barrigan Ayuno. The year is 3616, 1,000 years since the end of La Época Crema, the cyborg age, and the beginning of Wen Hoveo. Humans of wealth became one with the cyborg, becoming in turn spiritual machines and making the singularity fact. After reigning as gods for 5 centuries following this event, while the trench between these cyber gods and the poor of the world grew even larger, the diluvio of 2616 came and washed it all away. It went and left the earth dry. No digital infrastructure, no net of belonging, no reaching out across the Wi-Fi airwaves to touch somebody. Once a man, Ray K16 is now machine, immortal in data, immortal in body, but decaying. Soon, he will stop being able to move. His core nuclear reactor mini-model, the one that kept away the wasteland scavengers who feared scrapping him should this result in their irradiation, will melt down soon, fixing him to a single point on the face of La Tierra, forever, the prince of the singularity. He searches endlessly for ways.
Yeah. It's a long video, but I definitely encourage you guys to watch it and enjoy. But there are some very interesting moments in the video. Like I mentioned, this idea of immortality suddenly becomes kind of this curse, specifically happening in a world where climate change is a real thing. There are other elements that are sort of making this new world of the future unbearable to kind of be immortal in. And so there is kind of also a lot of humor into and absurdity into kind of a lot of the visuals and the narratives of the story. But basically, as Sofia calls it, this character begins to search for like what she calls a new body, which is spelled Nubodi. And a lot of these like the trade of this new body happens kind of in club, and so it is also a way for Sophia to kind of like make some commentary on how possibly like a lot of these like transactional scenes are often pictured inside clubs within sci-fi movies. And so I think what's also very valuable is the way that Sophia is very knowledgeable and kind of is bringing us a lot of insight into the way that like, or present day conversations on like what sci-fi is, or like what the future is, and then also sort of kind of adding this like new commentary and concepts that can challenge that in a way. And so the video is quite interesting. A lot of the music is also composed by Sophia and her partner and this group called Xuxa Santa Maria, which they form, as well as Las Sucias, which are also part of that. And so it's a really big collaboration that and quite successful sort of narrative exercise. And then next to Sophia's work, there is Ramon Miranda Beltran's work, which from right to left, which is the way that the flow of the exhibition kind of goes. The titles of these works are Interlinked, From Narcissism to Object, and then also It Takes Three to Love. And Ramon's work is quite exciting. A lot of these like photographs were taken throughout these like outings of what he calls, or this group called the Guano Group, which is an informal group to speleology, mainly informed by a lot of like anarchists like ideals. And basically they just get together to kind of explore these different cave systems in Puerto Rico. And he works a lot with like photographing a lot of the things that he finds there. And so Ramon's work has been very invested into kind of understanding how modernity itself has created these distances between object and subject. And so, for example, with that one right there, which is It Takes Three to Love, you see a lot of these rock formations, Taino petroglyphs, and as well as like these like scratched in and like graffiti elements. And so it's very interesting to kind of see like all these like kind of temporal qualities happening at the same time. And I think not only kind of talks a little bit about these relationships between like object and subject, and like kind of the petroglyphs being these like cherished, like very important pieces of history, and how this like graffiti possibly is not. But then I think Ramon would probably argue that whoever ends up graffitiing next to these probably has a better relationship of not just protecting and feeling a distance between that and the graffiti that this person is bringing in, but like both of these being equal expressions in a way. And so I think that that approach is quite interesting, as well as like also a lot of this work, and which was really hard to kind of narrow down the images that we wanted to include for the show. He has a lot of pictures, a lot of like just very interesting things that he's able to find inside these like cave systems. And so the cave within the ones here, and then a lot of his other work, the cave kind of becomes this sort of like entropic space where all these like rock formations and elements kind of collide. And that ultimately kind of like informs a sense of like timelessness, possibly like unsettling notions of like linear time, sort of multiple temporalities all happening, fictions, hallucinations, and realities that collide, that kind of in a way help us re-signify and relate again to sort of this idea of object and subject. And then lastly, we have Notes on Power from the series Mind Your Own Business by Gabriella Torres Ferrer. And Gabriella's work is also quite interesting, quite ephemeral. In this series specifically, they're like kind of referencing a lot of the paintings by Francisco Oller, who was someone who was a Puerto Rican painter who played a key role in sort of the development of like Impressionism, and was sort of thought as this sort of visual bridge between like the old world and the new world. And so Gabriella's work kind of gathers pineapples, cane sugar, sometimes rum, computer, just like these objects of usage, right? And so with a lot of this work, Gabriella is thinking a lot about the sort of interplay between like production dynamics, hierarchies of power, past, present, and current economies in the Caribbean, which a lot of them have been fueled, of course, by a lot of like colonial processes. And so, yeah, this kind of work goes from monocultures, being pineapple, being cane sugar, and sort of the production of these, to other things such as data and cryptocurrencies and sort of these economies of exploitation. And so some people might be wondering, like, what do these like cryptocurrencies and data mining have to do with a lot of these other past economies in the Caribbean? But in the past couple of years, a lot of it at the hands of like disaster capitalism and a lot of the things that have happened since Hurricane Maria, we've seen a surge of a lot of crypto investors that have moved into Puerto Rico. And so I think that is very interesting, the way that Gabriella kind of begins to establish like a new emergence of these like utopian economies that have happened since these like large events in Puerto Rico, and that in a way begin to highlight sort of these complex relationships of power, production, and colonial capitalist economic trends throughout time, throughout like the past, throughout what happens today, like thinking of like some like McDonald's and things like that, as well as like these new emergent ones that are for sure based on a lot of like utopic trends that relate to other ideas of like, I think how like hegemonic forms of thinking of the future. And so that was the last work. I think I think we can open up to questions, right, Ash?
Yeah, so we'd like to open the chat at this time to questions. I'll start off. I was wondering if you could go a little more in depth about the title of the exhibition and sort of the political event that title is responding to.
Yeah, so kind of going back into a little bit of Maria Jose's kind of work. In 2019, when we were having the protests, a lot of those protests just happened because there was this like chat leak between our governor and a lot of different representatives, also part of the government. And so a lot of the conversations that were being had in this chat were quite terrible. You know, there was a lot of mocking the deaths of the hurricane. There was a lot of discussions about corruption and things like that. And one of the things that was quite, I guess, that became a very big conversation was that one of these like representatives had sort of texted that he had seen the future, that it was wonderful, that there were no Puerto Ricans. And so that became a very big phrase that, of course, like appalled a lot of people and started a lot of conversations. And so I thought that it would be quite fitting to like revisit again that thing that had happened in 2019 and sort of give it this new context and switch up the phrase. And I think that phrase also kind of like deconstructing it in a way. I think that you read the phrase and I was worried for a long time that maybe people would not even finish reading it, because I think it's so familiar that you might not even finish it and understand that maybe there is like something added or something switched or contested. And so, yeah, I guess the using the title became a way to sort of also revisit the past and kind of add this new like contested version of this phrase.
Yeah, I enjoy how much that sort of ties into like La Futura and the play on words there as well, with seeing the future as feminine. Any questions in the chat? If not, thank you so much, Mariana, for your time and wonderful explanation on all of the works. And be on the lookout for the future event. We have a performance. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It's great.
All right, signing off.